Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to It's Knowable Presents, a series of in-depth interviews about topics at the intersection of truth, beauty, and Catholicism. I'm your host, Noah Braden, and on tonight's episode, I'll be speaking with Austin Suggs of Gospel Simplicity about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, that is, the future of Christianity. More specifically, we're going to discuss the current state of ecumenical Christianity, as well as what we can hope for in the future. So, without further ado, I will welcome Austin on. Austin, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
I sure can. Well, this is great. One of these days, I'll just be so comfortable that I'll stop asking people that, and that'll be inevitably be the time that it doesn't work, right? So,
Oh, I have so
well,
much respect for you do this live. I'm not that brave.
oh man, well, it's really interesting. So, I'm someone, and this is kind of true for me as well. When I do any type of public speaking, I'm someone who is absolutely a nervous wreck leading up to it, and then as soon as I actually start talking, I tend to kind of slip into it, and I don't know if I want to say like forget about what I'm doing, but it's kind of like I can get lost in the conversation or at least that's what I try to do. It's easier though when you don't have actually a crowd of people in front of you, right? You know, you can just kind of pretend that it's just the two of us in the room. Also, just as a little note, if I'm looking kind of over this way, it's just because that's the where my computer screen is. So I'll kind of be trying to make eye contact as best I can. But yeah, Austin, thank you so much. I'm really happy that you're here. Welcome to the show. I'm really especially excited to chat with you, honestly, because as an evangelical Christian who spent considerable time exploring both Catholicism and Orthodoxy, I think your approach to this conversation about ecumenical unity, I think you're becoming from a really unique vantage point. So I just personally am really excited to learn from you, and I'm just really grateful that you made the time to come on and talk with us. So we'll talk with me,
Oh,
but
it's my pleasure. Yeah,
uh,
thanks for having me.
it's my pleasure. So, before we dive in, why don't you tell the audience just a little bit more about who you are and a little bit about your work?
Yeah, certainly. So, people on the internet might know me for my YouTube channel called Gospel Simplicity. On it, I host guests from across the Christian tradition, talk about matters of church history and theology, hoping to bring simplicity out of some of these really complex topics. And the channel started many years ago just as a project for public speaking. One day, I made a video reflecting on my experience going to a Catholic Bible study, and all of a sudden, I was surrounded with this audience of really smart Catholics who knew way more about these questions than I did. And I did the only thing I knew to do, which was to find the smartest people I could to start asking the questions that I had. And so I started doing interviews, started doing church tours. And for the past, I think about 3 years now, 2 or 3 years, I've been just trying to investigate church history, make sense of these questions of the true church and where the church came from, where it is today, where we as Christians ought to be, and how we might inhabit a divided church. And so, yeah, it's the conversation we're going to be having today about ecumenism and related things are very near and dear to my heart. So that's me. That's my work on YouTube. Outside of YouTube, I am married to my best friend Eliza. We've been married for just over a year, and yeah, I've got a cat. That's about all the interesting things about me outside of work.
Well, that's fantastic, and I guess congratulations are still very much in order then for being a year married. That's wonderful, and
Thanks. Yeah.
yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, I've always been someone who has admired your work. I think particularly because of your ability to engage honestly and kind of at a deep level with all of these topics, while engaging with topics that are kind of by nature inherently in contradiction with one another in a sense, right? So you're kind of investigating these various claims, and some of which are exclusive claims to Christianity, and yet I've always admired the videos I've seen of yours, your tone and your approach and your ability to kind of really it just is very clear to me that you've come from an approach of genuinely seeking the truth, and that's something that I respect, and that's definitely why I've asked you on here tonight. So yeah, no, it's just wanted to say that from the get go. So thank you for what you do. I think we need more of that to steal Gavin's word, right? And I feel like he now has kind of complete ownership of the word irenic, but it is something that I value. I think he's right to kind of model that. So I think whether we're Catholics, I'm a Catholic, but whether we're Catholics or Orthodox or Protestants, regardless, it's just it's a breath of fresh air, right? So even before I became a Catholic, I was someone who was a big believer in open discourse, right? I was sort of more on the libertarian political side of things at sort of a younger time in my life, but regardless, always kind of that open discourse. And I don't know, Yeah, it's really wonderful. So, I would love to just dive right in then, and kind of ask you about what is your perspective on the current state of church unity? Can you maybe give us the lay of the land? And I know that's not an easy question, so maybe kind of zoom in and give us the summary version, and we'll kind of know it's not too detailed.
Yeah, sure. Well, there's a lot of different ways that we could approach this question. I think one way that I often look at it is through kind of two opposing forces at work that are at work not just inside the church, but are at work in the world kind of writ large. And that is we have this globalization in which the world is in some ways shrinking, right? Because you and I can have a conversation. I actually don't know where you're based out of, but you're not across the room from me. And so we can begin connecting with people not just across our country, but across the world. And in some ways, that has a natural way of unification, right? There's this opportunity to talk to people to bridge geographic and spatial divides in a way that we couldn't before. But there's also this polarization that's happening in the midst of that, right? Where people are also able to kind of find increasingly smaller tribes of their own and reinforce them with people on the internet. And so, at one point, if you would have had a really niche opinion on something, you might not have been able to find anyone in your town to talk to about that. But all of a sudden, now anybody can find their kind of group of people on the internet that think the same as them and believe the same as them and can kind of create their own little echo chambers within that. And so when we bring that into the church, I think, in some ways, we're seeing the church come together in unique ways. I think today, in kind of our post Christendom era, as the church globally is waning in influence, especially in the West and kind of developed countries, we have this dynamic where increasingly we're able to see across divides in maybe ways that we hadn't before. And I often lean on Father Joshua Caswell, who is the I can't even think of the superior general or something like that of the Canon Jugular in St. John Cantius in Chicago. And he always said, I think increasingly what's going to unite Christians is just the belief that God is really at work in the world.
Mm.
Because you might find that the people within your own church don't believe that, but the people in a denomination or tradition very different than yours do. And so I think we're seeing this dynamic where you have kind of a conservative evangelical watching Pints with Aquinas and finding more kind of resonance there than they would with some of the people in their own church. So in that way, it's bringing people together. But I also think we have this movement of polarization in the church where people are seeing the waning influence of the church. They're seeing kind of their traditions or their churches really in not great states in a lot of ways. And they're trying to hunker down and hold on to something that feels firm. And in a lot of ways, that can create kind of an insular mindset where it's like, I don't want to have any dialogue with those on the outside because we can't afford to lose anything more. So it's a long answer. In some ways, I think it's on the rise, and you could also look at kind of official statements and work at kind of the hierarchical level. And also on the ground level, I think people are coming together, seeing commonality across divisions. But in other ways, we do see some increasing tribalism and resistance to dialogue.
No, I think you made a really interesting point there with respect to the sort of the use of digital media and just sort of the nature of being online. Because as you mentioned, there is a kind of it's never been easier to find a community of like-minded people, right? And yet there is an inherent distance to the medium of sort of the digital world, right? I mean, just the fact that I'm based in Atlanta area, but you're right. I didn't even think to ask you where you were, right? It's not only that we're not in the same place; it's that I didn't even really think of that, right? Because from the optics perspective, right, from my audience's perspective, it almost doesn't matter because it's the same sort of same output, and yet there is something different, right, than if you and I were across a table from each other, able to kind of, or if you were at my house, right, if you were kind of like having dinner with me and my family, right, there's sort of a different nature to it. So I wonder about that. I wonder, and I wonder if you've kind of noticed this. Do you think that sort of that inherent distance kind of maybe emboldens people kind of to kind of toward that tribalistic kind of tendencies, or at least in some cases?
Yeah, maybe I'm going to be unhelpful and answer a lot of questions with kind of like yes and.
No,
But
please. This can be open-ended conversation. Yeah, no, this is great.
yeah, so on the one hand, I think certainly like we have more boldness in our comments and the way that we might interact with a YouTuber than we would if we were sitting down across from people. I generally think that some of the let's say less friendly comments I've gotten from people in my time on YouTube wouldn't be said if we were sitting across the table from one another.
Mm.
And I get that because whenever we kind of turn humans away from being like human beings into being kind of talking heads or something like that, it's a lot easier to not treat people like humans. And then that opens up license to do all kinds of things. If we look at any type of atrocity, like on a much larger scale, it always starts with dehumanizing people. And so the digital means kind of brings that really close at hand where we can see people not as humans, but as just kind of figures, and we can do what we will with figures. On the other hand, though, I do think it creates interesting opportunities for ecumenical dialogue, right? That I think there's so many people that have been exposed to traditions outside their own that never would have in the past because it would have required stepping through the doors of a Catholic church or stepping through the doors of an Orthodox church. And if they weren't able to interact with some Catholic and Orthodox people online first, if they weren't able to see what a church service would look like or have some feel of that or get to understand the theology, they might never have stepped over that threshold, both literally and metaphorically, of being able to kind of get outside their comfort zone. So, yes, it can embolden people to drive tribalism, but can also bring people together in interesting ways.
I really love that, and what you just described certainly describes my own story. I mean, I was someone who grew up Protestant, and at least in large part, in addition to sort of multiple books, of course, that I was reading at the time, but a lot of the Catholic content that I consumed during that kind of discerning period was indeed online, right? So I think you're absolutely right. As sort of a segue into that world, it's a wonderful thing. Um, oh, Austin, we're getting just a feedback that it's a little bit quiet on your end. Do you think that you could boost the volume just a little bit?
Yeah, I certainly can. People feel free to let me know if you can hear me better. I know I'm a soft-spoken individual, so I'll try to be a bit louder, or
And
at
it
least
doesn't help.
artificially louder.
It probably doesn't help that I'm the opposite, so there might be just like a weird contrast. Like I might be yelling into the mic, and you're talking like a normal, nice, decent, civil person. So we'll go with that. But I
Well,
think
I
that
have
might
turned
be.
up the volume, so hopefully that helps.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. And no, I think you brought up a really good point. And it kind of makes me think in a lot of senses. It's kind of it's not the digital media itself, rather, but it's sort of the purpose and the direction of its use, so to speak. In the sense that if the digital media is being used to point us to community, kind of to those relationships, to those. I mean, ideally incarnational sort of relationships, right? Whether that's in church or just in our community, then it's kind of a wonderful thing. I feel like for me, and now we're kind of getting on a tangent, but sorry, not a segue, a tangent, but I think maybe, yeah, maybe it has to do kind of with the direction. Like if people kind of stay in the digital world, that's almost where it becomes problematic when it becomes the end of itself, right? When it's a means to another end, it's sort of a wonderful thing. I don't know. What do you think about that? It's sort of not quite about church unity, but
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally that the online conversations lead to offline ones. And I think that specifically when it comes to the church, as people are investigating these questions of great import, I do certainly hope that people aren't only having a channel like Gospel Simplicity be their source of information. That I think that would be very bad, even as one with a vested interest in said YouTube channel. I think what it should be is maybe like a front door, like kind of the window display for these churches or these traditions as people seek to learn. But ultimately, these are things that there should be lived experiences. And, listening to a podcast is no stand in for going to church by any means. But if it can be an impetus for that, that's great.
No, that's wonderful. Yeah, very well put. So besides the sort of inherent challenges with digital media, what do you think are some of the obstacles and particular divisions that must be overcome in order to improve improve unity? Right. I'm not trying to paint a picture of like
Right,
you do
right.
these things and it magically like fixes 2,000 years of schism, but how can we kind of move the needle?
Yeah. So if we were to talk at like a doctrinal level, I mean, obviously it's going to depend on like unity between whom, right? But I think one of the big things that is a dividing point, at least between Rome and the rest of the world, would obviously be the papacy and figuring out what that looks like. And to give fair credit to the past few popes, there has been a lot of work on saying like, what would this need to look like for this to be acceptable to you? We're not going to change the doctrine of the papacy overnight, but we are willing to explore like what expression of this doctrine, and what kind of more where the rubber meets the road would be a version that could be acceptable to you. Now that those answers are going to be so different between different groups, right? Because if you're coming from a group that doesn't even have bishops, the answer's probably going to look different than if you're Orthodox, where you're a lot closer on that, and you're
Mm.
trying to get back to some, sense of agreement on the role of the Pope in the first millennium. But I think there's kind of, again, multiple dynamics at play here, because there is the theological level, which is really important. But I think any of these are going to happen in kind of at least two layers of, there's the kind of official hierarchical theological level, and we could take maybe the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church as an example of this, and they did like great work around the doctrine of justification, which has been like 25 years, I think, since the JDDJ, Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification, such a mouthful, since they came together and said, like, actually, if this is what you mean by justification and this is what you mean, then like the anathemas at Trent don't apply, because you're not saying what we thought you were saying, or whatever, or you're not saying what they were saying then. So that's important. But what's really interesting is there's also the ground level reality, because 25 years later, it hasn't really changed anything functionally for how
Mm.
a Lutheran and a Catholic might interact. And so I think some of the big barriers there continue to be just caricatures, misunderstanding, and not really knowing people who hold these opinions that you might look to in uh, as other, right? And so I think part of this is just for Lutherans to get to know Catholics and to see Christ in them. And I think that's one of the biggest parts of ecumenism, is really to see a common faith in the people that you would have seen as kind of completely opposed to you. And the more that that can happen, both at the ground level and at the hierarchical level, when you can combine those two things, I think that's where unity happens. Now that's complicated, and it takes lots of rubbing shoulders and lots of shedding of ink on official documents. But in broad strokes, those are things that I think are the constituent parts.
I love that you mention the dual need for the sort of the lay level, the sort of the ground level, as well as the leadership of the various particular churches and congregations. I think that's such a crucial thing, because, as you mentioned with the joint declaration, and I shared a link, if anyone's following along, I shared a link in our chat as well. But that was actually very impactful on me when I first discovered it myself. I was still Protestant at the time, but it was really powerful to me, because in large part, on the emotional level, my motivation to sort of revisit these things was in large part motivated by a desire for church unity, and something that I felt like I wasn't substantially contributing to, at least in my own self. So that's sort of like the personal motivation side, right? Certainly there were many theological barriers and other dominoes to topple on my way to the Catholic Church, but the motivation was certainly that. So I love when I see these types of joint declarations, and yet you make a really interesting point where it hasn't actually changed all that much. I mean, the prominent Lutherans I follow on Twitter are still largely saying the same types of things, prior to that joint declaration as they are now, and the kind of the general sense doesn't seem that actually much has moved, and in fact, maybe even just awareness of that document itself is perhaps lacking. At least it was from my former Protestant self kind of perspective. I don't know. So it seems like there's sort of all of these multiple layers, right? And work is certainly being done. And yet, if that work is not integrated or connected, it might be. I don't want to say it's not worth it, because I do think that moving the needle is always worth it, and I don't want to diminish it. But maybe it's kind of in a sense being undercut, or at least losing some of its potential.
Yeah, I think when any of these things happen in isolation, they don't have kind of sufficient strength to move that needle. That you really do need both the lay and kind of the hierarchical. If we were to use a different metaphor here, you could kind of talk like head, heart, and maybe we can add hands in here, right? Of like
Yeah.
the intellectual agreement between on doctrinal issues. Then there's also the heart of being able to just kind of see Christ in one another, and desire that unity. Because if there's no desire from the laity, I don't think it's going to be something that's pursued or something that's successful. But then we could even throw in the hands to extend the metaphor to talk about working together. And I think there's so many issues, even amidst the doctrinal disagreements, that people across Christendom, no matter what tradition they're in, can work together on. And I think when people do that, it helps to foster the other things. So whether that's on social issues, right, or working together in your city to meet felt needs. I think that's something that like you don't have to agree on the filioque way to try to feed the hungry, right? But as people do that together, as they kind of have that faith of the hands together, they begin to see Christ in one another, kind of that faith of the heart. Then it might propel them to say, like, can we work out some of these doctrinal issues? And that's not an easy thing. I'm not going to say that like that's something that you do overnight. Like, oh, now we can kind of figure out the filioque, or we can figure out whether priests should have beards or something. Like, I don't know, but I think it certainly helps.
I forget that that last part is actually in dispute. I sort of chuckled, and then I realized that it actually is or was, or in kind of small parts of Christendom, a thing. But no, yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and it's such an interesting thing because it really is a multi-layered. It's sort of, yeah, it's that top level, the sort of the theological foundation. I mean, those are going to be necessary things to address, right? I mean, especially the sticking points, the sort of the exclusive type theologies, or the contradictory type theologies, just because they can't be simultaneously true at the same time if they contradict each other, or at least according to classical philosophy. I don't know if we want to venture outside of that. And yet, I think you brought up a really good point. I mean, that sort of relational level, right? So I was raised to kind of believe that Catholics could be Christians, but that it was unlikely. That was sort of the framing of it, right? It was like almost like if they were, it was incidental to their their Catholicism, so to speak, right?
Sure.
And I think that this was taught to me. I mean, I think it was a misguided teaching, but I think it was also taught to me sincerely and without malice, right? I think it was a genuinely kind of heartfelt motivation. I really do believe that. And I'm still close with a lot of people who kind of taught me that, right? And yeah, I remember now that it just came to me as soon as you were talking about that. One of the things I think that was most impactful on my perception of Catholics was Mother Teresa, which is the profound impact of her life and work, because I remember it rattled me in a sense, because if I had this perception that maybe Catholics Christianity is sort of incidental, kind of almost like an accidental byproduct, not related to their Catholicism, and yet here is this devout Catholic woman who is so visibly Catholic, so clearly I can't say that she's not a Christian, right? Clearly I can't look at that. And I remember that rattled me. I think it was sort of on a deep level, right? It started to make me wonder. And I think those are good. Those encounters are good when we have those encounters that start to make us wonder. Because more importantly, I think it's what you alluded to, is that we're starting to see, the heart of Christ in this other person. And we're starting to kind of look past these denominational lines, not because they're not important, but because they still need to be framed correctly, right? From that, sort of relational approach. So I don't know. Yeah, that was just really interesting. I just thought about that own sort of anecdote in my own life that absolutely speaks to what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, if I look back on my own journey, the thing that started this in so many ways was going to a men's group with my uncle at a Catholic church. And, I've told this story many times on my YouTube channel, but my uncle, he hadn't been religious at all and was someone in my life that I'd always kind of wanted to see come into the faith and hadn't seen that. Eventually, he was diagnosed with cancer and began kind of exploring faith once again. And I get a call one day of saying, "Hey, do you want to go to a Bible study with me?" And I'm like, "Absolutely. Like, this is a literal answer to prayer." And then he tells me it's going to be at 5 a.m. at a Catholic church. And I'm like, "Ooh, I should listen more before I talk. Like, that sounds really early." And like, I didn't even know Catholics did Bible studies, but I was like, "Absolutely. I'm in. Let's do it." And just going to that and seeing Catholics who cared so deeply about their faith, not in spite of being Catholic, but because they were Catholic, gave me this new category, right? Because I grew up in a very similar situation where it's like people could be, you know, Christian in spite of being Catholic, but
Mhm.
their Catholicism was probably getting in the way of it.
Mm.
Meanwhile, I didn't really, I mean, I knew plenty of people who might take the label Catholic, but they were just like Catholics who, I don't know, did confirmation class to get the money, and like that was about it. Um, but all of a sudden, I came across these Catholics who loved their faith and were engaged in it, and so it kind of opened this door. And it wasn't until years later that it turned into a real interest of mine. But again, kind of it started at that level of just rubbing shoulders with people, which is a really powerful thing.
I mean, I love that. I mean, I think relationship is the heart of our faith, right? I mean, it's the heart of divine revelation. I mean, Jesus being the Word incarnate. I mean, it's all kind of that the incarnational relational emphasis is kind of found throughout Christianity, and it's a beautiful reminder, right? Especially perhaps for someone like me, and perhaps someone like you too, who were so involved in the books, the academic side, the sort of the intellectual side of theology, and that's wonderful, right? Especially if it deepens our faith. Um, But I think that we probably are. It kind of also uh, makes me come to think of is it Paul when he talks about, if you have all the knowledge of, can speak blah 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 blah, but you have not love, it amounts to nothing. It's kind of
Yeah.
a sobering reminder, right? Because if I think maybe it's when we start thinking about this sort of the practical ramifications, right, of our pursuit of these intellectual things, if they're leading us further to Christ, I mean, that's a wonderful thing, worthy of pursuit, absolutely. But if our pursuit of these kind of intellectual, theological pursuits is actually causing ourselves to not love other people, or worse, to like hate other people, and to start viewing more and more groups in that category of the other, in kind of an inimical sense, that's dangerous. That's scary. And it probably speaks more to our motivation and our heart, right, than it does about the actual thing we're doing, right? I'm certainly not bashing the studying itself, but it's really interesting. It's a sobering reminder, and I'm certainly reflecting on it for myself, as much as anyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we, want to do here again is like in our ecumenism, not lose head, heart, and hands, like have all three. And I think the reason that some people get suspicious of it, and perhaps rightly so, is that they do see it go awry where people kind of chop off the head entirely. Like if
Mm,
our tendency is to only live in our heads, I think they worry that for some, you see people and you kind of get these maybe a couple misunderstandings corrected, and all of a sudden you say, well, either like everyone's right or the theology doesn't really matter, and then they get really worried because they care about theology. But what I think we need is more people modeling what it looks like to really love across the lines, is like one of the mottos of my channel, right? To engage with people who are different than you, while not seeing that as necessarily a time to say that doctrine doesn't matter or that our doctrine should be downplayed in that, but to bring our full selves, like our full traditions to bear in these conversations, and still be able to love. Because if we can't love people we disagree with, like if our only options are to agree with people, like we have to agree with them to love them, or on the inverse, that if we disagree, we can't love with them, we can't love them, and we can't engage with them, we're in a really sad state. Like I think that's something worth reflecting on, that many people, they don't get down to that kind of brass tacks level of it, but is essentially what's underpinning their thought. So what we really need to get to a place of saying like, we can love in the midst of disagreements. We can work together. We can learn to get to know one another. And that doesn't have to change, like doesn't have to make theology not matter, but you do have to kind of be secure in your own beliefs. You have to be able to think outside of just the relational component. And so I just want to throw that out there for the people who might listen to this and say like, oh, like this sounds like everyone's going to just stop caring about theology. Absolutely not. It should sharpen our theology, like iron on iron, right? And I think done well, ecumenism doesn't make us forget theology, but it does make us see theology within a bigger picture of human relationship as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important, right? That it's that framing of it, really. It's
Mhm.
in some sense it's not the particulars, but it's sort of the approach and the way it's kind of framed.
Yeah.
Well, maybe just taking a step back, then I know we talked about this a little bit, but can you kind of, well, what is your vision for an ideal unified church? Like, what would that look like, right? Because I feel like even within the branches of Christendom, the articulations of that idea can vary quite a bit, right? I mean, some might even say that we're closer to it now. Some might
Mhm.
say that we're far from it. You kind of get this the spectrum and then everything in between. So, yeah, what's your vision for an ideal unified church?
Yeah, that is a good question, because I think a lot of people assume that the only model that people have in their head for a unified church is one that is hierarchically and externally, like in a visible way, united. But there are a lot of people out there who would take a position of like, no, church unity doesn't actually require that. It is more like a unity of spirit or something like that, like a coming together, a united front amidst differences. Sometimes I use different analogies here where you could think of it almost as like allied nations in a war. Like some would say unity is just, these different nations, they have their own setups, they have their own beliefs, but they're all working together. And that's better than them all warring with one another. And while I think that may be the the most realistic hope, I do tend to find myself more on the, like, all things considered, it would be better if we all were together as one in one tradition, like with visible unity. Now, I think that's a very lofty goal. I don't think it's one I'll see in my lifetime. And so I think, allied nations is better than warring nations. But and in the end of the day, like a real united kingdom, a real, like, we have visible unity, we have unity of spirit, we have like the sacraments together. Um, Maybe that could be like a step in between, depending on how ecclesiology's worked, right? Like just a unity of spirit. If you can share the Eucharist together, I think you're pretty much united at that point, even if you're still working some things out. But the ultimate thing would be like a full visible unity. Um, I'm not sure how we get there. I mean, well, it's not that I'm not sure how we get there. I Again, I'm not necessarily hopeful I'll see it in my lifetime, but I think it's a thing worth trying to move towards.
Yeah, I mean, why would you say that it's so important? Why would you say this is a goal worth striving toward? That is Christian unity, visible unity in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons, but people wouldn't have to look further, I don't think, than John 17, where you
Mhm.
kind of have Christ's high priestly prayer before he's going to the cross, right? And he says, Father, may they be one as we are one, right? And that and is by how they love one another. Now we're going back to 13 here, right? That they will know that they're my disciples, right? And that there's something to our unity being a witness to the onlooking world that we are Christ's disciples when we love one another fully, and that he desires us to be one as he and the Father are one. So I think that Christ's heart for unity is so apparent in not just John. I mean, I think we see that throughout the Pauline letters as well, throughout all of the New Testament, that there is this desire for unity. But even if we didn't have that, I think we could just look at it objectively and say, like, is a united church better than a divided one? And I don't think it takes a lot of thinking to say, like, well, yeah, yeah, it is. It's going to be more effective, right? Like, we're not going to have so many kind of overlapping attempts to reach the same people. We can actually work together on things. We can work together on social issues. We can do better theology when we're not focused on throwing stones at one another. So even just from like a purely pragmatic standpoint, it's better. But I think when we look at a theological level, it's the heart of Christ. And if Christ prays that the church should be one, I think that's something we should all pursue.
Absolutely right. I mean, the language he uses is quite firm, right? Remain one as I and the Father are one. It's and that's a that union is quite a profound union, right? It's sort of not
Yeah.
only inseparable but a very deep and relational union, which I think brings us back to what we've been talking about. And it's really interesting. Someone in the comments mentioned that Protestant unity is often described, or excuse me, oftentimes Protestants will say that disagreement exists, but on non-essential matters. And I think that
Mm.
does actually remind me of sort of a somewhat important point, that I think a lot of times this lack of shared language, this lack of shared definitions, really, I think is a stumbling block. And I think that's why those documents are so important, like the one that you mentioned earlier about the Joint Declaration on Justification. But as well as there's been similar types of dialogues and progress made with Catholic and Orthodox relations regarding the
Mhm.
filioque, essence and energies. There's been various types of things where it's like maybe we are indeed articulating the same truth, but using different expressions. Now, if indeed that's the case, and we can kind of uncover more and more things like that, that's a beautiful thing, right? Because neither group, whichever two we're talking about, no groups are sacrificing the truth in order to. There's no compromise of truth. It's rather a renewed sense of understanding. So I think
Mhm.
that's like a really powerful thing. And I think if there's any kind of reason to be optimistic, it kind of lies somewhere in that, right? It's not that, okay, one group will say we were entirely wrong and you were entirely right. Like that's a hard thing, right? But if we can subtly move the needle on these various conversations, I think the tapestry of those conversations in aggregate can actually make some real difference, or at least I think it has. I think I've seen it. But it's hard sometimes, right? Because even my optimism, no doubt, is kind of overshadowing sometimes my perception. So it's challenging, right? You almost have to work as if it's not happening and hope as if it is.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of saying it. That we have to hope that it is happening, work as if it isn't. I think is something
Yeah,
that you said.
yeah. I think I said
Yeah,
exactly that, just the opposite way. But yeah, no, exactly that.
yeah, okay, yeah. I think absolutely, and I think that people can be discouraged when they get in these conversations because if we look at kind of the ecumenical movement, in some ways it's not that old, but in other ways it feels like it's been stalled out for a while. So like after Vatican II, we have this flurry of ecumenical activity of all of these kind of coming together as of various bodies to say like, how can we work these things out? And a lot of them follow the exact pattern that you mentioned there, of trying to understand what people mean. Like, is this just a difference of terminology? And again, I know you put the link in there, like the JDDJ. That's exactly its format. It's like, when we say this in our kind of Lutheran speak, we mean this, and when we say this in our kind of Catholic speak, we mean this. And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, okay, like maybe we do agree more than we thought. In other ways, we've kind of seen that stall out in more recent years of maybe hitting kind of terra firma on some of these issues, right? And seeing like, oh, okay, maybe we're in difficult places. And I think some people have been discouraged, like, oh, is anything happening? But I think in a lot of ways now we're seeing kind of that grassroots unity come about, and hopefully that it, even though it's slow and it can be imperceptible at times, if we keep working at this, I do also hope that it is working, and intend to keep working as though it isn't yet.
No, I like that, and I think there's yeah, I mean, I guess I take some consolation even in the fact that so many of these ecumenical dialogues are occurring right online, and there
Mhm.
seems to be a, I mean, it's a bad word, but I've come from marketing background, so it seems to be a demand for it, right? In a sense, like I think people
Yeah.
are eager for it, right? And something that I often think of, and I think this occurs in many sort of tribalistic type situations, right? Where I like to think that there's this kind of the great silent majority, right? Where yes,
Mhm.
we're hearing these kind of loud and angry voices on the extremes, right? And they're distracting and they cause confusion, and there are real problems that are being addressed sometimes, and that need to be addressed. And yet there does seem to be so often this kind of great silent majority that craves unity, craves peace, craves I don't know what it is, but just something else, right? Something other than those two extremes. Um,
Mhm.
and so I don't know. I think I take consolation in that. I think that it can seem sometimes like the online world is quite dark and antagonistic, and there certainly is plenty of vitriol. And I'm sure you've been on it longer than I, so I'm sure you've kind of you've seen it. But I don't know. You're so nice and diplomatic. Maybe you haven't seen that much of it, but regardless, I'm sure you have, whether directed at you or others. So I don't know. It's an interesting balancing act, though, for sure. Are there any other practical steps that you think are probably worth mentioning that either individual Christians or individual denominations can take? I know we've talked about approaching the conversation, remembering that it's a relationship between Christians. We've talked about kind of that language barrier and trying to pursue kind of theological unity by kind of hashing out. Are there any other kind of maybe ground level type things that you recommend?
Yeah. So if we return to kind of the head, heart, and the hands model there, right? Like I think we talked about of the hands of kind of working together. And there's a term that often comes up in these conversations of co-belligerency, which is just a fun word. And it's like, what are the issues that we can kind of be mad about together? Which as like just a societal point, like I'm not sure that's the end all be all of unity, but in some ways, like if there are issues that we can both say like this is wrong and we need to work together, it is a way of coming together. And those don't have to be hot button issues. That could again be like, people in our town shouldn't be going hungry. Like if I think about where I live, like it is too prosperous in this area for there to be people that don't have food to eat. Like, and there's too many churches for this to still be a problem. Like, let's work together on this, because we'll be more effective if we work together. And so finding those ways to work together, and chances are in people's cities and towns where they work, that's already happening. Like there's probably already homeless shelters where people from across different traditions are coming together to work, or soup kitchens or things like these, and finding ways to get engaged in that. And I think it's worth pointing out that maybe if you're in some type of position of leadership in a church, maybe not just replicating what the church down the street is already doing, but saying, how could we work together on this? Because this isn't an issue where a difference in theology can keep us from working together, right? Like just because, again, like they put the filioque in the creed doesn't mean we can't fill out like fill backpacks for kids schools together. Like we'll be more effective if we do it together. So rather than kind of creating parallel institutions, find ways to work together. We're looking at ways of kind of bridging that heart divide. I think again it's just like finding ways to rub shoulders with people that can start on the internet, but ideally like find people in real life to just sit and listen to, like just hear their experience. One of my favorite things to do is just like hear the testimony of someone who, and I know that's kind of Protestant language, but like hear
I love
the
it.
story of someone of like what's your journey of faith been like in your life? And especially with someone outside your tradition, chances are you're going to find a lot of points of resonance there. You're like, wow, I see a lot of myself in that. And then as far as the head, maybe we've talked a little bit less here on the practical terms, but I think there are very practical things you can do. And I think that would probably start with just reading the best of these other traditions. So often, I think what happens is we compare, say, like someone's trying to look into like Catholicism versus Protestantism. It's like, let me compare like Thomas Aquinas to like my, Bible church pastor. And like that's just not a fair fight. Like if we were to talk like boxing, like that is just not a fair weight class distribution there. We're talking about like Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest minds of all time. And no offense to your local church pastor, but he's probably not Thomas Aquinas.
He'd
Um,
agree. He better agree.
yeah, but and vice versa. Like I think sometimes we compare like the best of Protestant Bible commentators to the one Catholic we met on the street one time who's read their Bible like twice because they're just a nominal Catholic. Like, and to say like this represents all of Catholicism, but look at this like Protestant Bible commentary. Like that's not fair either. And so I think what we want to do is try to learn from the best of these traditions. That's not to say that you have to read like every major work from these traditions in order to be engaged in ecumenism. But to the extent you're able, just try to expand your reading a bit to learn a bit and learn their language and see how they think.
I really love that. And I think kind of baked into what you're saying is kind of a recommendation to go to the sources, right? I mean, don't just
Mhm.
read about Catholicism from Orthodox or Protestants and vice versa, right? Because I think there's a great tendency to straw man, each other's arguments. And it's so easy to do, especially if we're getting our information about that movement only from secondary
Mhm.
sources, which are taught from our own tradition. So maybe there are some very valid points. Like maybe a Catholic critic makes great analyses of certain kind of times in history. But if our only perception of that, I don't know, whatever reform group in that moment of history is
Mhm.
from that Catholic, it's going to be inherently skewed, and that's, I think, something to just keep in mind. And I think not only seeking out the best of each movement, which I absolutely wholeheartedly second, but I think just being careful not to let your perception be filtered through another tradition. Get it from the source. Learn about Catholicism from Catholics. Learn about Orthodoxy from the Orthodox, and learn about Protestantism from Protestants, and the best of them also, of course.
Yeah. If we were to bring this into the internet, like there's this hilarious, I mean, it's not really hilarious. It's kind of sad, but and I get why it happens, but like there's this dynamic that I can't help but laugh at a little bit of where I see all these people that like only watch rebuttal videos of certain people. Like they don't actually even watch the original video, but they watch like the rebuttal, or you don't watch the debate, you watch the debate debrief afterwards. And so you get like the most, I don't know, like censored version of it. Like you only have the kind of counter arguments. And I get it. Like we don't all have time to watch all these videos. I don't have
Sure.
time to watch all of them. But if we are to take this conversation of like go to the source, which would be like Aquinas, but if we were even to take that to like the internet, rather than just watching the rebuttal video, like maybe watch the original video,
Yeah.
on these many things, or instead of just the debate debrief where like there's no opportunity to answer, like watch the actual debate. Um,
Yeah.
and so, yeah.
No, that's such a great point, because it just creates this filter within a filter within a filter. And if we can kind of continue to frame this whole conversation in terms of kind of going back to the relationships at the heart of Christianity, it's kind of another barrier between you and that relationship, right? So imagine if I learned about you, Austin, but I learned about you from one of your great critics, right? And I never actually saw any of your stuff. I only watched. I don't even know who your critic is, but imagine this critic. Imagine you have a great critic, a sort of a huge rival, right? And I only learn about Austin from them. So not only is the inherent digital medium kind of providing a barrier between us as human beings, but then there's also another individual barrier in between us, in between myself and you. And then if my judgment is filtered entirely through that, it's really interesting, because I think it's helpful, of course, to be just aware that that can happen, right? I mean, I think that's part of it, just kind of being mindful of it. But I think you're right. I think it has to go beyond that. I think it has to be this intentional effort that if this is something that is important to you, right? If you're basing a large part of your belief system or your intellectual, theological, philosophical framework on X idea, yeah, make sure that you've really, approached it in that sincere, kind of honest way. And I think, I mean, I almost want to like pause here, because I think that I understand perhaps why people are reticent to do what we're recommending, right? I think there's an understandable fear in one sense, perhaps having your mind change, right? I think this is like a deep
Mhm.
subconscious fear that a lot of us have, maybe all of us. We we want to be consistent, right? So in the best sense, we want to be consistent within ourselves. We want to kind of maintain that consistency of belief, whatever that is. So there's always a little bit of a fear, right? And a natural fear. If, oh my goodness, maybe I'm going to about to be completely changed or converted, if you will, which is just means,
Mhm.
right, to be changed. I don't know. I don't know. What are your thoughts? I feel like I don't quite have the idea formulated.
I think I see where you're going with this, and maybe I'll kind of transpose it to another situation, which might kind of put a finer point on it,
Please.
which maybe makes sense why people are worried. So, for instance, like I don't talk about this a lot on my YouTube channel. It's not something I'm actively engaged in today. Like I'm primarily engaged in inter-Christian dialogue, ecumenical dialogue in that way. But there was a time in my life where I was more engaged in kind of inter-religious dialogue, and it's
Mm,
something I'm still open to doing. But for instance, at one point, like I went and got tea at a mosque, and a lot of people would be like, "Whoa, like that's a step too far." And my answer would be for a lot of people, I think that would be a step too far. Like there's
mm,
a sense in which that wouldn't be a responsible thing for a lot of people to do. I was very comfortable in my faith. I was very comfortable having conversations with people whom I disagreed with. And I recognized like I didn't know any Muslims. And people would ask me questions about Islam and what do I think about it. And when you're just critiquing this thing that has nameless and faceless in this way, you've never really like talked with real life Muslims, it just didn't feel fair to me. And so I felt that I was at a place in my faith at that point where I could just go and have tea and talk and say like, help me understand because I frankly know that I don't understand. So if we were to take that back into kind of inter-Christian dialogue, I think there is this fear of like engaging with people who are different than me could change my mind because it's true. It very well could. And if that's not something you're open to at all, then exposing yourself to different viewpoints is, maybe not the thing for you to do right now. I think ideally we get to a place where we're secure enough in our beliefs and where we have a strong enough desire for unity amidst differences. And maybe we begin to see some of these people, especially within kind of like Christian ecumenical dialogue, as not the enemy, but people who see things different than us. They're
mm,
important things, but they're not things that make one not a Christian. And then you can enter into those conversations willing to do that. But I would say, like, if you have no shelf space for your mind to be changed, and you simultaneously recognize that your beliefs aren't that firmly rooted, then like probably don't watch my videos because you'll come across people who are smarter than you and disagree with you. Like, and I
mm,
think about this all the time that I'll interview people on, an issue, let's say like the filioque, and both of the people, like I'll interview a Catholic and Orthodox, and both of them are far smarter than me. Both know far more about the topic. And if my mind was swayed just by people being smarter than me, I'd hold any number of opinions. Um, but I think, if you're in a place where you're able, you can kind of calmly enter into these things, you're able to weigh them, then you can do it. I don't know, that's a roundabout answer, but I think you're tapping into something that is real. Like
mm.
engaging with people who are different than you can change your mind.
No, I think that oh yeah, thank you. I think you explained it really beautifully. I think that we have to know ourselves, right, and kind of be aware of our own weaknesses and limitations. But also on the flip side, I kind of want to encourage anyone who kind of is afraid of that, to cling to the foundation. I mean, cling to that which you are sure of, right? It's fully acceptable to kind of have a foundation and then go out and venture outside of that foundation and engage with ideas over here without
Yeah.
forsaking that foundation, right? But you have to be aware of what it is and you have to have it, it has to be stable. And I think that's what you're getting at. And if you're not sure of that foundation, well, maybe that's a signal that the foundation does need to be reinvestigated. But at the same time, it probably is good to start by revisiting your own foundation rather than going outside and learning about myriad alternatives all at the same time and just kind of descending into confusion. So yeah, no, I think there's a lot of wisdom in what you said there. A lot of that resonates really with me.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can think about it as like a developmental journey too. I
Mm,
don't have kids, but I can imagine people with kids like at some point you teach your kids that like there are households who do things differently than us and like that's okay, but this is how we do it here.
yeah.
But you probably don't do that like right away before they're ready for that, you know? Like there's probably this element of, okay, I want you to understand like this is how we do things here and like that's not changing, like this is our foundation. But at some point we want them to see that the world's bigger than their kind of nuclear family and recognize that there's people who to do things differently, and eventually you're going to have to learn to interact with those people. And that's okay, and that's good. And I think just a big part of this, and I hit on it a little bit, but for our own conversation here, I think it's important that people remember that the fact that there's people out there who are smarter than you or who can argue a point better than you doesn't necessarily mean they're right. And I think when you can accept that idea, you can then go into these conversations a little bit more openly. Like, the fact that they have a better argument than you doesn't mean that your position is necessarily wrong. It might just mean that you don't know the arguments for your position very well. Because if you were swayed by every person who is smarter than you, again, like, there's adherents to every viewpoint in the world that I'm sure are smarter than me. And so I think just having that comfort of that not being the litmus test is important.
No, I think you bring up a really, really good point. It's something that I've thought about a lot, and that's kind of to always be aware of the cumulative cases, sort of substance for your viewpoint, right? Because it's easy to get distracted by like a single argument that pokes a single hole, and what and then if that in and of itself is enough to cause you to question everything else, it can be somewhat challenging, right? And like you said, it could be very much you just don't know a good response to it, right? But another smarter person has already kind of addressed it thoroughly, and you can go and read it, and then you're kind of renewed in your belief. But I think it's important for us, and regardless of like where you're at, whoever's listening to this, I think it's important to kind of remember the strength of the cumulative strength of arguments for a certain worldview or against, right? Not about like a single tiny micro discussion, like you're not quite sure, like raise some doubts, some questions you can't answer, like maybe the whole thing is just completely wrong. Like that's a scary leap to make, right? Whereas
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's just like, let's keep this in isolation. Let's approach it in the compartmentalized context that we should address it. And maybe even if the result of that addressing it is just a question mark remains, that's
Yeah.
fine. Still keep it in that compartment, so to speak. I don't know. I sort of think in very visual terms. I'm not sure if that's helpful, but I think there's something there.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to keep visual terms, we can maybe talk about like concentric circles too, because
Mhm.
someone made a comment earlier, and I don't think this is the point they made. They were getting at, but they mentioned that uh, essentially Protestants disagreeing on what's essential. And I think when we go into these conversations, it's really important to think about that kind of those circles of, you could call that like dogma, doctrine, and opinion, or you could call that
Yeah.
like essentials and non-essentials or whatever. And to have a firm sense of like, what is it that is at the core of your beliefs or at the core of your tradition, and what are questions that you can be more open on, and
Mhm.
getting a good sense of that, I think, is really important. Because then maybe for you, like, you explore those periphery issues where there's room for disagreement. Maybe if you're a Catholic and you're thinking about kind of like predestination or something like that, and you're trying to work through these questions, and the church has left open some space there, or if you're a Protestant, like, there's plenty of space there.
Yeah.
And on these questions, and being able to be comfortable with like, okay, this is what's essential, and these are areas where we can have disagreement, and that might be the place for you to start before you begin dialoguing on the more essential things, like if you want to kind of wade into the pool slowly.
I love that, and not only you're talking about the gradation of what's necessary, and I've actually done a short little video in a mistranslating Catholicism 101 series. I've only done 2 videos so far, but just like little short videos explaining it. And one I did was on necessity, and one was on infallibility, just because they're
Mhm.
two of the things that are just so often misunderstood. And it's exactly what you said. There's levels of what's necessary for a Catholic to believe, and it's such an important frame of reference. And I think you're right, because there are so many things that we can find agreement and overlap in those kind of second and third tiers. The sort of the non-dogmatic circles, so to speak, and oftentimes there is a lot of overlap. And I think if we can identify where those overlaps occur, we're probably going to be in a better position to actually address where disagreements remain. If for no other reason, because then we'll have a better understanding of the language that other person is using, the
Mhm.
context that they're coming from, right? Because I think that maybe is another danger in kind of not understanding where someone else is coming from, right? We can, ironically, be too compartmentalized, too hyper focused on the kind of conversation at hand, and and not actually about kind of trying to understand where the person is coming from. But maybe this brings us back to motivation, right? If we're just trying to win the conversation, that's not really going to be a great result, right? Regardless of whether we want it or not.
Yeah, I often like to think of these kind of explorations as the difference between us sitting across the table from one another and having kind of like this battle stance of like it's me versus you,
Mm,
and trying to like duke out like the truth in the middle, versus coming around the same side of the table and saying like the truth is out there, like the truth just is, and let's look at that together, right?
mm.
Because the truth should be good for both of us, and this doesn't have to be a kind of a battle stance between us, but it can be something we journey together towards. And I think it's so important that in the midst of this, we don't get kind of ego wrapped up in being right. And so much of that happens online, right? That we're in this to kind of win points, and we want to be the one who is right because that makes us feel good and that helps us build an audience. And that, has all of like we get this dopamine hit of like, yay, I was right.
Yeah.
But much what we should be looking for is like, how can we come together and how can we pursue truth? And sometimes that will come to claims where we disagree, but the goal should never be to like defeat the other person, but to really help restore everyone towards truth.
I absolutely love that, and I think that that framing of it is going to be a really helpful one for anyone within the Christian tradition. That is the pursuit of truth, right? Because we all acknowledge that God is the ultimate source of truth, and goodness and beauty. But I mean, like at least let's focus on the sort of the truth in terms of the transcendentals. I think that's a really helpful way to approach this as Christians in ecumenical dialogue, right? It's not so much like, oh my goodness, maybe I'll end up Catholic, or oh my goodness, maybe I'll end up Anglican, or whatever it is, whatever that kind of fear in the back of your mind, or if you're Catholic, maybe, oh my goodness, I'll end up Orthodox, or whatever that fear is, right? Maybe it's not actually so helpful to kind of over kind of focus on those names and the labels in that sense, and rather like let's focus on the pursuit of truth, right? Now certainly as a Catholic I believe that Catholicism contains the fullness of truth in sort of in a complete sense, so that is a belief of Catholicism that I absolutely believe, but yet the kind of the motivation that took me there was a pursuit of truth, not a pursuit of
Mhm.
religion. So maybe there's something there, right? Like if we can unite in our pursuit of truth, come together in these kind of shared things, hash out some of these language barriers and take real care to kind of understand where the context is coming in. I bet you there will be a lot more agreement. Almost, I don't want to say just that would happen because it wouldn't be just happen to be a lot of hard work, right? But I think that we could find that there's more agreement hiding than we might think.
Yeah, I'm going to try on a new metaphor for size today. I haven't thought of this one before, but as you were talking about that, you're saying, one belief within Catholicism is that the fullness of truth is contained within Catholicism.
Mm,
And so the idea should be that as a Catholic, your pursuit of truth should not lead you away from the church, but it should actually just lead you further up and further into, use C.S. Lewis's
absolutely.
language. And it made
Mm,
me think of like people going on like a scuba diving expedition. Just bear with me for a second, right? And I think so much of our disagreement and our fighting happens at like the surface level. Like we haven't even gone underwater yet. We're just so scared that like once you go under that surface, it's going to lead to some destination other than where you want to be. But if we're all pursuing truth, the idea should be like just keep swimming down. And if you believe that the Catholic Church is truth, then it should just lead you deeper and deeper into Catholicism. Like it's not leading away, but you don't have to keep battling people at the surface as though like going below the water is going to be dangerous. But like just keep swimming, Dory. Like just keep doing it, and it's going to work out.
I love that. And you're absolutely right. We don't have to fear, right? Because if we're genuinely pursuing God and we're genuinely trying to get a better understanding of him by pursuing truth, then yeah, I think that there is a lot of peace in that searching, a lot of peace in that lack of knowing that we can have. Because that's something that I know that a lot of people wrestle with, right? And I think by nature of our talking about ecumenical dialogue, we're talking about ecumenical disagreement, and of course there are quite a few essential disagreements, scattered among mainstream Protestant, among mainstream Protestantism
Mhm.
when compared to, not to mention, compared to
Sure.
Catholicism and Orthodox. Sorry, I said that really, really poorly. But the point is that there are essential differences, and I think it brings us back to
Mhm.
something that you mentioned earlier, that in our desire for unity and in our genuine seeking for reunification, um, we can't overlook these very real, doctrinal differences. So I guess I just want to kind of zoom in a little bit and pick your brain about how Christians can balance that desire for unity with the importance of maintaining doctrinal integrity.
Yeah. I think the first thing that is important here is seeing a connection between faith and the spiritual life. Because I think the reason that so many people leave doctrine behind is this faulty notion that doctrine actually just exists kind of in the abstract and it doesn't affect our lives. And therefore, since our lives are what matters, and doctrine, like, we can kind of put it aside. If we're all love Christ, like if we're all just doing our best, then who cares about doctrine? So I think the first thing is to say, well, throughout all of these traditions, there's historically been this commitment that, like, orthodoxy, right belief, leads to orthopraxy, right? Like right practice and right life. And so I think we have to, for many people, get a renewed sense that doctrine does matter, not because it matters to have, like, to check all the boxes and to be the one that wins the argument and to be the one that's the most right, even though those are, I guess, bad things in isolation. It matters because it affects our faith.
Mm.
And so having an appreciation for doctrine is one way that we can kind of keep that from going awry. But on the other hand, it's recognizing that, right faith and right living matters too. And so we can't only look at these things in isolation. Like, we want to bring them together. So I think oftentimes the temptation has been to make doctrine not matter, but I think there are some people for whom they get so caught up in doctrine that they forget that, like, why it matters, and seeing it within the life of faith, and trying to bring that together as well. I don't know if I answered your question fully there, but that's
I think you
that's a
did.
first thought. Yeah.
No, I think you did, and I think that as is so often the case with these kind of hard decisions, right? When you're kind of trying to decide between multiple good things in a sense, or trying to discern, what's the
Mhm.
best among goods. There's often this tension between 2 points, and the only way forward really is to kind of keep both points kind of in hand simultaneously, or kind of connect your tightrope, if you will, to kind of both endpoints, right? And it's kind of only by securely fastening yourself to both ends can you actually walk across. And I think that that's kind of often the kind of case when you have these kind of the tension points between.
Mhm.
I don't know if that helps, but that's kind of what came to mind when you were talking about this. And I think above all, what I'm just reminded of is the necessity of humility, in our approach to these conversations, right? If we have this prideful approach to this, so often I think that will close the door before we even really get into a conversation. And it makes me think of so many of the things that we've discussed tonight. From the misunderstandings, the different languages, to the lack of understanding different contexts, and so much of that can be mitigated, I think, by humbly approaching the conversation, by genuinely asking questions, like trying to actually learn where the other
Mhm.
person believes and why they believe it, not just refute them and kind of argue with them. And yeah, there's something there, because I think that I actually asked this in a group earlier this week, kind of asking people what they thought were some of the biggest barriers to ecumenical unity, and one that kept coming up was pride. And I think that's a really interesting one, and I think it's often the case. And it's sad, not only because of the practical impact on ecumenical unity, which is certainly a very sad result of that, but also I think on the impact that we have on others who are witnessing us, right? So one of the things that I think a lot about, and that's something I talked about a few days ago with Michael Lofton on my show, is like
Hmm.
how to criticize the church the right way, and sort of implicit in that conversation is like, how can we disagree with charity? And something that we kept coming back to was just the optics of it are terrible when you think about non-Christians watching us fight online. And certainly that's not to forsake any doctrinal integrity, but I think there is something to be said about the time and the place and the way that we do it, and the way these conversations happen. I mean, the way the disagreements happen, right? Because I know we've
Yeah.
been talking all kind of assuming very positive conversations, right? You and I think we're both very diplomatic people, and I can tell that we're kind of genuinely trying to. I think we both would love for these conversations to continue with everyone, kind of at scale, right? But I think there's also something to be said about the very real disagreements that will happen, and maybe they even need to happen. But I think if that's the case, we still need to be mindful of the optics in terms of how they happen, where they happen, who's watching them happen.
Yeah, and it brings us back to some earlier points, but I think there's some important questions there that often don't get asked. And some of those are, like, should we even be having some of these conversations online? Like, is that the format that makes sense for this? That this would be kind of this public debate and this public spectacle that we're going to make by disagreeing? Because there is more to YouTube than us getting views. Like there's such thing as bad press on YouTube for the Christian faith, right? And I think there's also questions that people who maybe are aspiring to get into the YouTube space should be asking too of like, does everything need a response? Because I think we've adopted this mindset of like, for certain people, we are defenders of the faith and our job is to respond to every issue, both inside our church and outside of our church. And I would just ask people to pause and ask, like, is that really your job, and is the net impact of that going to be positive? Because I think we can so easily become just obsessed with controversy and obsessed with kind of growing these platforms, and the best way to do it is by disagreeing with people and having these really hot takes. And I think we should be asking, like, is this prudent, and is this leading people towards faith, hope, and love? And if it's not, I think that's something we should really worry about.
No, I think you're absolutely right, because there's the motivation we have to be mindful of. Like, are we motivated by love? And there's also kind of the result of it, right? Is the impact of this disagreement, this conversation, this whatever it is that actually resulting in pointing others to the source of love, which is ultimately the purpose behind all of these things, right? And that's something that we can all agree on as Christians, regardless of our denominational backgrounds, right? Or we should be able to. That like the purpose of these conversations are ultimately about truth, and our motivation for pointing people to that truth is in order to point them to love, right? To God. I mean, to Christ on the cross. Yeah, it's so interesting, because it's so easy, I think, to lean into either of those extremes, right? Avoidance, for sake of unity, kind of, which is almost
Mhm.
it's a cheap unity at that point too, right? Because
Sure.
there's sort of a devaluing of the truth in the process of it, but then the other side of just fighting over every single theological minutia that is possible, and it almost just seems to come at a place where it's like there's no possibility that I could have anything wrong, right? Which kind of speaks to, I think, that lack of humility. And it's something, actually, one of the comments, I can't remember who mentioned it, so I apologize, but one of the comments earlier mentioned, highlighted all the beauty of orthodoxy and how much Catholics can learn from the mystical traditions. I think that's absolutely true. And I've I had some really profound spiritual experiences attending an Eastern Catholic parish here locally, and kind of falling in love with some of the Eastern liturgy, and kind of
Mm.
diving into their understandings, and how they center their entire faith and liturgy, in a sense, around like the Jesus prayer, or what the Jesus prayer represents, and kind of how it's all built on this kind of perpetual prayer practice. It's beautiful, right? It's absolutely beautiful. And there's so much that Catholics, especially sort of Western minded Catholics, can learn from these beautiful
Mhm.
Eastern traditions. And no doubt vice versa is also true, because the West, with the scholasticism, has developed these robust intellectual defenses of really challenging topics that it's really important in certain academic spaces, right? And there's something there, and the Protestant just focus on just the authenticity, the community, the realness. I mean, my point is, there's so much that we can all learn
Mhm.
from each other, right? And I can say that while still believing that Catholicism contains the fullness of truth, and I think that all of us should be able to say that about the other, in some sense or another. And it's hard, right? It's hard. It's work, and perhaps it's easier for me because I come from that tradition. I grew up Presbyterian, so I know how they think. So I'm also sympathetic in some sense to their cause, right? And I know it's not all malicious or anything like that. Whatever the straw man version of it, no, by no means. I think there's a lot of sincere disagreement, and then I think there's also a lot of sincere misunderstanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just to give credit where it's due, I think, in some ways growing up in that tradition can be helpful, but for what it's worth, I see so many people where that's actually unhelpful, where they end up defining themselves against what they came from. And some of the most kind of outspoken critics of ecumenism, or the ones who struggle the most to see any good in those with whom they disagree, are actually the ones who used to disagree. So I'm so glad that you have, I think, done that work to be able to not just say like, I'm going to define myself wholly in opposition to where I was, but to be able to fully appreciate the beauty of where you've come to, while also seeing value in traditions different than your own. So I think that's a really good thing.
Well, I appreciate that. And I will also admit, lest it seems like it came easily to me, it really hasn't. I think my initial reaction after converting was to sort of go after the context that I came after. I think there was very much a sort of a reactionary thing. I wanted to talk with all of my Calvinist friends and show them why they were wrong and yada yada yada, because that's what I knew and that was the weight of the argument. And then it was really interesting, actually, something that really helped me, and some of it was just God humbling me, and that's certainly a factor. But it was also really interesting. One of the classes that I'm in a master's program at Notre Dame right now, studying
Hmm.
theology, and one of my classes on ecclesiology, I had the opportunity to compare and contrast John Calvin's ecclesiology with the Counter Reformations, and it was a
Mhm.
really fascinating research project because. In many ways, I was shocked by the similarities more than I was shocked by the differences, right? So there were some very important and significant differences, but largely they were a matter of nuanced interpretation of the main principles, which were largely in agreement. And so it was really a fascinating thing to kind of really go back and like study John Calvin and study
Yeah.
ecclesiology in particular, right? Because I'd already read a lot of his theology when I was in the process of converting, but to go back and study his ecclesiology in particular, and to see all the similarities, and then to kind of see the Counter Reformation's responses to it and how they were hashing out like what is the visible versus the invisible nature. Both of them admitted that the church has both qualities. Like it wasn't that they denied that. It was that one of them, the Counter Reformation, believed that the visible qualities of the church were essential and inseparable from the other qualities. It was almost like the emphasis was
Mhm.
radically shifted. And yet the structure, the framework wasn't so different. So I just found that to be really interesting because at our vantage point in history, looking back 500 years back on the Reformation, and talking to modern Calvinists, perhaps, or neo Calvinists, or whatever the appropriate term is, and I'm not trying to be derogatory, I just mean whatever the self described term is. It's challenging because so many times these modern iterations of the classical Reformed beliefs have actually ventured quite a bit from the Reformers themselves. So this is not necessarily a criticism of modern Protestants, though perhaps there is something there. But it was actually more of an exhortation, I think, to modern Protestants to maybe go back and learn, what your fathers of your tradition actually believed. If you're Lutheran, go back and study Luther. You might be surprised to find out some of the things that he believed. And same with Calvin, and same with Wesley, and same with Knox, whoever your kind of heroes are. And I think there's just something to be said about that, because I think Catholics and Orthodox often think about that emphasis, right? Let's go back to the fathers. Let's read the church fathers. But Protestantism does seem to be almost focused on the hyper modern, the hyper contemporary.
Mm.
At least that was my experience within the sort of Protestant and evangelical space. So I don't know. I would think it was kind of it was encouraging to me in some ways, though, because I think it made me think that maybe there was less of a significant difference then at that point, and some of the differences have actually been kind of heaped on over time and over history. So I don't know what it is there, but maybe if we go back to the roots, we can actually bring some clarity to the conversation. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say. Maybe there's some clarity to be found in going back.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. It goes back to that idea when we were talking about kind of the injunctions for specific kind the faith of the head or the ecumenism of the head there, of going back to the sources, that kind of ad fontes intuition. And I think, especially, yeah, in Protestant circles, it can be super helpful to actually read Calvin and Luther, which is not something that a lot of people do. And I've said in the past, and I think I'd stand by this, that if I hadn't gotten to study under some brilliant Calvin scholars and take classes specifically on Calvin, even though I don't identify as a Calvinist, I think I would have probably become Catholic or Orthodox like during my time at Moody, perhaps quicker, because I had no respect for the Protestant tradition when I started looking into these things, because I was comparing Aquinas to the pastor down the road. But
Right.
then when I began to see kind of what was at the heart of it, I got a much deeper appreciation for the depth there and some of those intuitions. And so, yeah, I mean, as intimidating as the institutes can be, I would encourage Protestants to grab a copy and start reading.
No, I think that's a wonderful reminder for all of us. I have probably just like a final question, but I thought it might be worthwhile, if you're okay, to just take a couple questions from the chat, if you don't mind.
Sure. These people have been kind enough to be here. I'd be happy to answer their questions.
Well, fantastic. I'll try not to give us anything that puts us on our toes.
No worries.
Let's see. So, from my lovely wife, actually, she was the first one up. I'm not just prioritizing her. What are some of the most valuable lessons you have learned from your interreligious and ecumenical interactions? Do you feel that these explorations have made you a better follower of Christ?
Oh, what a great question. So some of my like favorite experiences some of the best experiences I think was the first part and how they made me a better Christian. Do I have that correct?
That's right. So it's what are some of the most valuable lessons you've
Oh,
learned
valuable lessons.
from
Okay.
your ecumenical dialogues, interreligious or ecumenical dialogues, and then have they made you a better follower of Christ?
Yeah. So some of the best lessons I think has have been to just genuinely be curious, um, and to assume that I don't know everything, which sounds so basic. But I think we so often go into these experiences thinking like, I know what the Catholic Church teaches, even though I'm not Catholic, or I know what the Orthodox Church teaches, even though I'm not Orthodox, because I read some things online, and trust me, I know. um, and to go into these conversations rather being as a student saying like, no, like teach me like from, and you don't even have to speak for your whole tradition, but like do I want to learn, and so tell me like help me fill in the gaps, but also be willing to ask the genuine questions that you have. Say like, hey, when I look at this doesn't make sense to me, but I know you're a smart person, and I know there's lots of smart people in this tradition, so can you help me understand this from your perspective? And really just trying to build that muscle of seeking to understand rather than win arguments, to seek to ask good questions and to assume that there's things to learn have been, I think, some of the most important lessons I've learned. I would say it's probably changed a lot of the ways that I think about how God's at work in the world as well. I grew up in, I wouldn't say it was like fundamentalist, but it was leaning that way in some ways. I think the church I grew up in, it can have a very narrow view of what God is doing in the world, and who might we be able to call Christians. And for me, I think I've taken a more expansive view of that without losing a real love for doctrine. I mean, I'm a theology nerd through and through, and I think it really does matter. But there's just certain things that I look at now and say, like, I can't help but see Christ in these people. Um, and to say otherwise would just feel like a lie. And so I think those have been valuable lessons to not assume that I have all the answers, and to just try to be open to what God is doing in the world, even if maybe that's different than what I might have thought. Has it made me a better Christian? Lord have mercy. I hope. I hope it certainly made me ask deeper questions. It's certainly, like I said, expanded the way I think about what God's up to in the world. Um, yes, one of the most beautiful things that's done for me is really expanded my prayer life
Mm.
and just given me access to resources that I didn't know. I mean, like right next to me here, I've like got a rosary here. I've got things all around me. Um,
You probably got a
Things that I just
hotkey somewhere lying around, I'm sure.
I do, yeah.
This is my
I've got
bracelet. I have a real one somewhere. This
a
is my little bracelet one.
statue here.
Yeah.
I've
I
got
love it.
icons beside me, and just gave me access to things I didn't have before, and has really
Mm.
helped deepen my faith in that way. Um, so I think, yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. I think that's a great answer, and I love in particular that you emphasize prayer, because it was something
Mm.
that I think hoped to ask about before, but it didn't really come up, or I didn't bring it up, and I think that that's a really important one. I think you brought it up in a very interesting way, though, because I think prayer is something, a particular thing that we can learn about from these different traditions, right? And we can kind of grow
Mhm.
in our faith by studying the prayer practices of the different traditions. And I certainly know that's been true for myself. And interesting enough, actually, the Jesus prayer and the Chotki was something that I grew to be comfortable with long before I grew comfortable with the Rosary. So
Yeah,
even in a
same.
sense, okay, I was gonna say I come to think that for Protestants that's probably a common thing. I imagine, like, from a Protestant mindset, the Jesus prayer on the prayer rope is a much easier stepping stone than the Rosary. And the
Yeah.
Rosary is just much more complicated, right? There's just a lot more going on. There's a lot more kind of pieces. But anyways, I kind of as a Protestant studying these Eastern prayer practices, and then eventually going to Catholicism and studying the Catholic prayer practices, I would definitely wholeheartedly agree with you that my prayer practices have grown substantially as a result of that, and not just because I became Catholic, but as a result of that exploration and that diving into all the different ones. Yeah, no, I love that.
Yeah.
Um, all right, so we have a dual question here.
Okay.
So it says, Noah, what are some things that Catholics could be more open to in these ecumenical dialogues? And Austin, same question, but what about Protestants? Um,
Okay.
that's a really, really good question. So I think the one that's just top of mind for me. So I don't know if this is sort of the most important one, but it is certainly the one that is sort of most on my mind due to kind of maybe what I've been reading and watching online. Is I think that Catholics could give Protestants the benefit of the doubt more and better with respect to sola scriptura.
Mm.
Um, so I think that this can come into play in a couple different ways. I think there can be an emphasis on the shared understanding of solo Dei verbum, only the word of God. That is something that is actually commonly shared in belief. Now it's defined differently, to be sure, but it's sort of a shared belief, and I think that. Not only that, but we Catholics and Orthodox, we do. I think I can speak for Orthodox. I know that I can speak for Catholics. Do elevate Scripture and do acknowledge it to be an ontologically unique thing that does, as the inspired written word of God, does bear a unique quality and has a unique place in the church and the history. So I think that in some sense, Catholics, in pushing back against sola scriptura, go way too far, and they've almost pushed too far against sola scriptura, denying even the very foundational elements that we actually agree to. So I think that there's, and I think it's sort of dual. So I think there's the pushing too far backwards, and then also just not giving the benefit of the doubt that there are good reasons that led to that belief, and it's not just as silly as like the specific example that I would just tell all Catholics to stop saying is like sola scriptura is not in the Bible. Like, see, like you lose. Like it's like, come on, we can go so much deeper and go so much farther than that, and recognize that there are some real reasons to believe that in opposition to apostolic authority. I don't know. That's just what's on my mind right now. What do you think, Austin?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I just add just a little
Yeah,
point there.
please.
I think anytime that we feel that we can knock down a central argument of another tradition in one sentence, it probably tells us that we don't understand the argument, because these things have been around for a while. And so if you think you can do it that quickly, you probably need to go back to the books and see that maybe we're missing some nuance here. But as far as things that Protestants could be more open to, it's tricky because it depends on the type of Protestant. But I think one would just, like at a popular level, especially for maybe evangelicals, coming from lower church settings, is to recognize that so much of what they might perceive as odd in the Catholic tradition is actually like embedded into the Protestant tradition. So if we want to think about things like the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, that's not foreign to Protestantism. And I always kind of cringe a little bit when Protestants like go into these things and just try to ridicule it as something silly. It's like the the great voices of Protestantism, at the very beginning, the kind of fathers of the Reformation in that way, like most of them did see this at least in some type of real way. They might have expressed that in different ways. I think another thing I would add, though, that has been big for me, again, coming from a very low church, I grew up in kind of like a mega church-ish setting,
Oh, okay.
um, was the idea of like going through the motions, and often kind of ridiculing that, and that any type of worship that it involved a lot of repetition or things like that must be somehow lacking in real fervor, or must be somehow dead. I just think that's so far from the truth. And I think even if we just look at it from like a psychological level about how we're formed as people, that ritual is actually something that's really important, and repetition is really important. And I think beginning to appreciate liturgy as something that, maybe it's not your preferred cup of tea. Like maybe you still prefer the big bands and the big production. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but learning to see that, oh, this doesn't mean it's dead just because it's different, I think would be a big thing for people to see.
I love that, and I definitely had to come to realize that myself. So I came from a low church Presbyterian tradition, and first encountered high church liturgy in an Anglican church.
Mhm.
That's kind of one of the places I actually sort of an Anglo-Catholic kind of Oxford movement church. That I think that means something to you. I think I saw
Okay.
an
Yeah.
interview on your channel about
Mhm.
that. So it's sort of insider baseball thing, kind of outside of these ecumenical dialogues, but that's where I first kind of fell in love with liturgy. I think that's a beautiful point, to not assume that the repetition sort of has some lack of authenticity or whatever the kind of assumption can be. No, that's great. I definitely second that. All right, so. And of course, you're welcome to ignore any questions. I'm just sort of asking them as they come. Has Austin been attending Mass on Sundays or daily Mass? And what does he think about Franciscans, Dominicans?
Okay. I think 4 questions there. So I have not been attending Mass on Sundays. I do usually go to daily Mass about once a week. Um, what do I think about Franciscans? I think Franciscans are universally seen as cool, aren't they? Like, doesn't everyone think? I don't know. Maybe they
I
don't.
think they're cool.
Uh, but yeah, I don't have like a deep,
Yeah.
take on this. And Dominicans, most of them are way smarter than me, which I think is cool as well, for lack of a better adjective. Yeah, like, I don't really have like a strong opinion on Franciscans or Dominicans. I respect them, but I think I need a more specific question for that.
No,
But yeah.
it's funny. I have very little to add to that other than to say that I generally agree. Yeah, Franciscans are cool and Dominicans are smarter than me. I mean, that sort of that sort of sums it up. Or maybe the Franciscans are cooler and the Dominicans smarter. There we go.
Yeah.
um, all right. And we have another question. This one I believe is directed towards you. I have not read it, but Christopher asks, "Have you read Francis Chan's most recent book on Christian unity?"
I have
Um,
not.
Okay. Then I guess the follow up question, which I think we can answer more generally, is where should we locate our Christian unity? So, what would the
Uh,
source of that unity be? That's a great question. Yeah. What do you think?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I think the source of the unity is ultimately the Holy Spirit. But I
Mm-hmm.
think that ideally that would manifest in a external visible unity, um, or sacramental unity would be just tremendous. But it could also look like more of a unity of spirit at the lowest level. Not low. I don't want to like degrade that, but in a sense of recognizing Christ in one another, seeing one another as on the same side, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, I'd say the source is ultimately in God Himself.
No, I think you're exactly right, and I think something we keep circling right is this concept of the other, and I think it's really an important thing to be aware of. Right, we're just going to be much more
Yeah.
likely to resist and reject, that which is unfamiliar to us. And it's not bad that something's unfamiliar to us, and it's not even bad that we're resistant to it necessarily. But it is bad if we're not aware of that because it can kind of slip into, it can skew our judgment, really. I think, and also make us, write off people, when we shouldn't, right? And when we're discussing ideas and disagreeing is always great, but writing off people, not so much.
Yeah.
um let's see. Just circling through, trying to make sure I don't miss any
Hmm.
questions. Ooh, I think you mentioned this. I think the last question we have from the audience, and then I'll just kind of wrap it up with one of my own, is a great one, because I think you alluded to it earlier about believing in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. So the question is directed to you. Do you
Yeah.
believe it? And maybe more generally, can you just talk a little bit more, like unpack what you were talking about with respect to Protestants believing in the real presence?
Sure. Yeah, I can do both. The first answer will probably be shorter. So I do believe in the real presence in the Eucharist. Obviously, we could double click on that and talk about mode of that real presence. And it's that the particular mode of the real presence isn't something I'm overly dogmatic on. I would I think like transubstantiation is a fine way of describing that. I think Luther's kind of I don't want to characterize Luther here, but essentially like I don't know, it says like this is my body. It is like deal with it. Kind of in the Lutheran tone there. I think that's fine as well. And even Calvin, I think Dr. Brett Salkeld does a great job in his book, Transubstantiation, showing how actually close Calvin is uh, in many ways to the Catholic viewpoint. It's kind of almost a matter of like directionality of like God coming down versus us being brought up to partake in the body and blood in that way. But yeah, so I guess in a roundabout way, I've gotten at the second part of Protestants believing in it. So Luther has just a very realist view. If you look at Luther, he pretty much in his trademark anti-philosophy way doesn't seek to explain it too much. He basically says, like, Christ says, this is my body, it is. And he also famously said, like, I'd rather drink what did he say, I'd rather drink blood with the Pope than wine with Zwingli. So he felt very strongly about this, right? Like he thought this wasn't something that he didn't think the real presence was something to meddle with, and he was not happy with Zwingli for meddling. Calvin has what's sometimes unfortunately referred to as spiritual presence. And it says a lot about our current way of thinking that when we hear spiritual presence, we think somehow that means not real. But for Calvin, of course, spiritual did not mean not real. In fact, spiritual was very real. And I think we should all agree with that, right? But for Calvin, he has some kind of philosophical qualms with this idea of Christ being present on all of these altars throughout the world. And so, uh, we're going to kind of truncate this real short to answer the question. But for him, in the Eucharist, we are brought up to partake of Christ in heaven. So the kind of directionality is upward rather than kind of God coming down into the Eucharist in that way. But he does believe that we do really partake of the body and blood of Jesus there. He does some in like different letters. Sometimes he's less clear than people would like him to be, but the best place, there's a couple places you could go, but book 4 of the Institutes is where you get church and sacraments for Calvin, and so he's going to talk about it there. He also has like a short treatise on the Lord's Supper as well, if people wanted to get into that. But then of course there are Protestants who take a less realistic view, primarily kind of descendants of Zwingli, and you'll generally find them in lower church settings. But yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. That was a wonderful summary, and I think it's what you just described is one of the other reasons why I think it's so important for Protestants to go back to the Reformed Fathers, so to speak, and kind of actually study them, because the Eucharist, or I should say, the lack of centrality of the Eucharist in the church that I grew up in was actually one of the first things that caused me to start exploring other traditions. High Church Anglicanism, and then eventually, kind of paving the way to Catholicism. But it was actually because I became convinced that the Eucharist needed to actually have the central top spot in a church service, right? This was long before I believed any number of other type of Catholic leaning beliefs. I just was like, no, this should be the center of the service, not a 30-minute sermon about something. Like, it seemed that there was something wrong there. So that was something that, like, for me, a long time before. And then I remember reading Calvin, and I believe, I don't want to misquote him, I don't remember if he recommended it being done weekly, but he certainly recommended it being done frequently. I remember that was the emphasis.
Yeah, that is a little funny thing with Calvin. So Calvin, which sheds light on another thing about Calvin, but he did want it to be weekly, and he felt
I
strongly
thought
about
so.
the
I just
fact
didn't
that
want to lie on air.
yeah, but he never got his way. So they didn't actually do that in Geneva, which is just an interesting little data point. For some people kind of make a caricature of he was essentially this like dictator of Geneva, and had like ruled with an iron fist. But it's interesting to note that he wanted weekly communion and he couldn't get that. So I don't know how successful his dictatorship was if he couldn't control the cadence of communion.
That is really interesting. That does surprise me that he didn't. I never actually read the follow up side of it. Did he get his
Mhm.
way? But he didn't. That's really interesting. So are you doing okay on time? We do have a few more questions that have popped up. If you're okay,
Sure.
or keep going. Okay. They're really good questions, which is why I don't want to stop. So do you have any practical advice for seeking out relationships with Christians of other denominations? It feels difficult to find fellow believers of distinct traditions when we attend different churches. Yeah, do you have any?
Oh, yeah. That is a really good question. And I'll admit I've been like a bit spoiled in this because when I started doing it, I was in Chicago, like downtown, where it's just really easy to find all types of people. And they're all in walking distance. And also I generally now have a lot of people come to me, because I have somewhat of a public platform. It depend on if you're willing to go to something like Like if this was a Protestant asking, and they're like, "Hey, I can't give up my Sunday. Are you like if you were willing to go to like a Vespers service somewhere, like on a Saturday, that would be one way to meet people. Another would be to look for those organizations that are maybe already doing work that would attract Christians of multiple denominations, like maybe a homeless shelter or something like that, where people, if you're aware that people are working together, a lot of cities will put together like prayer nights for people from different traditions. But yeah, it's difficult. Those would be some places to look into, though.
I think that's a really great advice. Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add to this is something that kind of came up earlier. I think Austin, you mentioned it, is just kind of look for opportunities to kind of do service together.
Hmm.
Kind of serve alongside. I think that's a great opportunity. If you're a Protestant, maybe look into volunteering in a Catholic charity, maybe, and vice
Yeah,
versa. I think those could be really, really wonderful ways to serve the Lord alongside each other in a place that it's not going to come down to differences of worship or necessarily theology,
sure.
but or like the hands focus that we were talking about earlier.
Hmm.
Um, all right. Well, that will conclude the Q&A section, and then I'm just going to finish with one more question of my own, and then we'll
Sure.
wrap it up, Austin. So, what do you hope for with respect to the future of Christianity, and what do you think is kind of reasonable for us to hope for?
Yeah. What do I hope for with the future of Christianity? Well, I suppose, broadly speaking, the salvation of souls, and that we would all look more like Christ. But of course, that feels like a bit of a pat answer to get, I guess, closer to the conversation we've been having today and like Christian unity. What do I hope for there? I hope that we continue to find ways to work together. I hope that we continue to see Christ in one another, and that even amidst our disagreements, um, even while separated, that we continually call one another brethren, if we to kind of steal that language. Um, and I think when we do that, really powerful things can happen because again, when we see people not just as human, but as our brothers and sisters in Christ, we can begin to work together. And so, the more that we can see that happen, the better. So, yeah, that's what I hope for. Was there a second part of that question?
No, I think I think I just articulated the question in two different ways. So that was really
Mhm.
perfect. And yeah, it's I love that. The Catechism talks about Protestants being the Catholic Catechism talks about Protestants being separated brethren, and I really
Mhm.
love that distinction, right? And I think that you're right. Putting the emphasis there is really wonderful. Um, well, is there anything else that you would like to add to the conversation before I wrap it up?
No, this has been wonderful. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, Austin, thank you so much again, and thank you all for tuning in to tonight's episode of It's Knowable Presents. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and stay tuned for more in-depth interviews. We have a couple more that are already scheduled with Braden, the catechumen, as well as with Kyle Whittington. Both of those are coming up in the next couple weeks, so make sure to subscribe, and thanks again for tuning in. God bless.